Hugh Lovatt, Israel-Palestine Project Coordinator for the European Council on Foreign Relations, Middle East and North Africa program. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. How do you explain it all?
Good evening. Well, I think there's two scenarios. The first one was that this was that the Israeli government was clearly looking for a provocation or to escalate. The second scenario is that this was just an unfortunate series of mistakes. And I actually think at the moment it seems like it's the second scenario, whereas your correspondent was saying that this was supposedly a routine Israeli mission deep into Gaza that went wrong. And I think that actually just heightens the sense of tragedy here, that, as your correspondent was saying, that there was a sense in Gaza that calm might at least prevail for another 3 to 4 months, that the socio-economic conditions were slowly improving, and that there could be some sort of perhaps informal arrangement between Hamas and Israel. And I think what happened last night was it was some sort of mistake, and that now, this sort of miscalculation has pushed both Hamas and Israel into a series of confrontations that I think are pushing them towards a war that neither really wants, but each side now feels it has to save face and it needs to try to preserve their deterrence against the other. And so we're again on the precipice of another conflict, unfortunately.
Hugh, we've been talking about some of the outside players like Egypt. Who's going to tone it down?
So we've seen flare-ups in Gaza since at least this summer, quite serious flare-ups. Over the summer, reportedly, both sides were about 30 minutes from a full-on war. And each time we've seen very effective intervention, mediation efforts by both Egypt and the UN. And so I have no doubt that both sides are now, both the Egyptians and the UN team there, are frantically trying to push each side towards de-escalation. So ultimately, that's the best bet. But as I said, I think there's a series of calculations, on sort of zero-sum calculations that are emerging on both sides that will make this increasingly difficult to diffuse. Plus, the political considerations, both in Gaza and in Israel, I think are slowly limiting the room for compromise.
Limiting the room for compromise, nonetheless, is this in Israel's interest if you are, as you say, in a cold, calculating manner, looking at tactics and zero-sum games at a time when Hamas appears weakened and where that compromise with Fatah in the West Bank remains elusive?
So I think when Israel looks at this in a very cold-blooded manner, I think it decides that escalation is not in its interest, purely because there is no better scenario than a scenario in which Hamas continues to control Gaza, I think, from Israel's eyes, in that Israeli securities see that Hamas is actually able to, when it wants to at least, to maintain a degree of calm and stability, police a ceasefire with Israel and rein in more radical groups. Bringing the Palestinian Authority back to Gaza is not currently achievable and may not lead to the same sort of security arrangements that we currently see inside the Strip. So I think this is the reason that we have seen the Israeli government make quite significant steps on Gaza, allowing in fuel to power Gaza's electricity, and now funding for the salaries of Hamas civil servants there. So I think that's what Israel would like to see continue. That's what the Prime Minister would like to see continue, because ultimately Netanyahu, I think, is quite risk averse on this file. But we should remember that elections are approaching in Israel. Elections probably, I would say, by March or April. And that the Israeli government has been under pressure externally from other political groups in Israel over the perception they've been too soft on Hamas. And there's also been infighting within the cabinet on the same issue. So I think, while, as I said, neither side, and especially not Netanyahu, will want another full-on escalation, I think the politics make it sometimes more difficult to walk away.
And on the Palestinian side, what's the calculus?
So I think from Hamas's point of view, Hamas again is not interested in another conflict. The conditions in Gaza have increased exponentially since the last conflict in terms of unemployment, in terms of poverty rates, psychological issues, etc. And I think a lot of people you talk to in Gaza, really fear what would happen to the Strip and its inhabitants if it goes to another war. So for Hamas, it's preventing another war. It's allowing for a degree of social or economic relief, easing Israeli sanctions. I think that's a first step. And then as a more long-term step, I think Gaza would like to slowly rid itself of the responsibility for governing the Gaza Strip. But to do that will require the Palestinian Authority under President Abbas to come back. And so I think while we can still perhaps see some progress on the Hamas-Israel track if we don't have a war in the next 24 hours, I think the internal Palestinian track between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is much more complicated. And I think that's more difficult to see how one moves forward on that.
Hugh Lovatt, one final question. How do you keep the world's attention on a very high-risk situation where there's fatigue on what seems like an endless cycle?
So Hamas's answer for that actually was what's called the March of Return protest that we've seen since last May. And Hamas would credit those protests with not only forcing Israel to negotiate with it bilaterally, albeit indirectly, but also putting the issue of Gaza back on the international agenda for policymakers and also the media. Besides that, unfortunately, it tends to be another war that sort of recenters interest or focus on Gaza. So I think, this is, again, another tragedy that ultimately we can't go through another war. Another war, at best, leads us back to where we were. At worst, pushes Gaza even further into crisis. And so I think there is perhaps still a unique moment to try to push forward a sort of a more holistic approach to Gaza that deals with the economics, but also the politics. I think that ultimately is the only way to achieve a more sustainable solution for Gaza.
Hugh Lovatt of the European Council on Foreign Relations, many thanks for speaking with us.